Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
How are we supposed to put ourselves out there and speak up for the marginalized if it might mean we could be marginalized? On the other hand, if we care for the marginalized, how can we not speak up? These are some of the questions people are facing these days as Trump's atrocities continue to pile up. But thousands of angry and frustrated people are showing up at rallies and calling on the Democrats to do something and stand up to Trump and Elon Musk. There was a Stand Up for Science march in Los Angeles on Friday. And speaking of science, if you haven't listened to Monday's episode yet, I covered the measles epidemic and interviewed Janet Kellogg-Ray and asked her why we can trust scientific consensus about vaccines and why so many Christians don't trust scientific consensus. Friday's march in Los Angeles was made up of scientists from USC and UCLA who were protesting cuts to funding as well as many of their colleagues getting fired. In fact, the cuts to funding and jobs are so pervasive for higher education right now that there were 32 different protests over the weekend specific to protests for science. Duke Hahn, who is professor of psychiatry and family medicine at USC, told the LA Times, "A lot of us are trying to figure out what we can do. A number of us are becoming more politically active, or politically active for the first time." Then on Saturday, Columbia University student Mahmoud Khalil was arrested by ICE after helping to organize a pro-Palestinian protest. Despite the fact that he has a green card, Trump officials want to deport him. Khalil's lawyer says Khalil has been identified, targeted, and detained due to his involvement in protesting for Palestinians. Khalil's arrest has led to additional protests around the nation over the Trump administration taking away Khalil's free speech. But Trump is calling Khalil's arrest the first of many to come, while Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, called Khalil a national security threat. So again, I ask, how are we supposed to put ourselves out there and speak up for the marginalized if it might mean we could be deemed by the Trump administration to be a national security threat? The more Trump acts like a dictator, the more it's making people angry, which has led to boycotts of Elon Musk's company Tesla. Since the middle of December, Tesla has lost half of its value. And on Monday, Tesla's stock fell 15%, which was their worst day in 5 years. That led to Trump posting on Truth Social, "To Republicans, conservatives, and all great Americans, Elon Musk is putting it on the line in order to help our nation, and he is doing a fantastic job. But the radical left lunatics, as they often do, are trying to illegally and collusively boycott Tesla, one of the world's great automakers, and Elon's baby, in order to attack and do harm to Elon and everything he stands for. They tried to do it to me at the 2024 presidential ballot box, but how did that work out? In any event, I'm going to buy a brand new Tesla tomorrow morning as a show of confidence and support for Elon Musk, a truly great American. Why should he be punished for putting his tremendous skills to work in order to help make America great again?" Then on Tuesday, Trump turned the White House into a Tesla dealership, basically. With 5 Teslas on the White House South Lawn, Trump inspected the cars, talked about how he thought they were the most beautiful cars ever. He mentioned how much he loves driving, even though he hasn't driven in years. And he noticed how the Tesla had computers. And then Musk got into the passenger seat of one of the cars with him while the two of them talked about the brake and the gas pedals. You know, he was standing there with the script, basically, of Tesla talking points. Meanwhile, anyone who protests what Trump and Musk are doing to the marginalized are supposedly un-American, radical lunatics, and are engaging in illegal and collusive activity. And sure enough, on Wednesday, after Trump promoted Tesla at the White House, Tesla's stock rebounded 8%. So what can we do? Do we boycott Tesla? Most of us can't even afford a Tesla to begin with anyway. Do we protest and risk getting arrested? Are there other things we can do other than sitting around and being upset at the Democrats for not getting their act together? Dr. Susan M. Shaw is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. She's the author of Intersectional Theology, an introductory guide, and is a senior columnist for Baptist News Global. She wrote a piece for BNG on March 6th called 12 Things You Can Do to Resist Trump's Reign of Terror. I thought her piece was especially helpful in giving us some tangible things we can do, so I sat down with Dr. Shaw to discuss her piece. So, I'd like to ask you some questions about your article that you recently published called 12 Things You Can Do to Resist Trump's Reign of Terror, that was in Baptist News Global on March 6th.
Hmm.
So, in your introduction, you mentioned how overwhelming it can be to process everything Trump is doing to the point where it almost feels like there's nothing you can do. And it's interesting how that's precisely the strategy. Like Steve Bannon referred to it as flooding the zone in order to overwhelm us.
Hmm.
But then you say there's something somewhere on the list each one of us can do, no matter our circumstances. Each or every action counts as we build momentum, even if you've never participated in activism, if you care about what's happening to the most vulnerable in our society, pick one action and start there. So I'm curious if you could speak into that a little bit more about choosing one thing amidst the flood while knowing that the flood is meant to send us more than we can handle.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult time for those of us who care about issues of justice and equity, inclusion. And I think it's easy to become overwhelmed with everything that's going on. And like you said, that's the strategy, that's the point. And we can convince ourselves that our small actions don't make a difference in the face of the onslaught of executive orders and policy changes and you know, Republican capitulation to what's going on. And I think that it takes some discipline on our part to stay the course and to say that I still believe that our voices can make a difference. But it takes all of us, right? It has to be a movement. It has to be a collective and organized action. And that's why I appreciate what some of the groups that I mentioned in the article are doing to organize us, to show up for protests, to participate in boycotts, to show that it's not only individuals, but that there is a collective. And we know that a third of Americans didn't vote for this. Another third couldn't be bothered to vote for whatever reason. And so there are more of us who do not support what's going on right now. And we need to come together to make something happen so that our voices are heard, even if all we can do is hope that maybe by the midterms we can reclaim one or both houses of Congress.
Yeah, and I loved how you gave specific links to different places you could support. And speaking of those boycotts, you mentioned participating in boycotts against companies that support Trump, as well as showing up for protests.
Mhm.
And but then, especially this week in the news, we've got Trump calling the boycott of Tesla illegal. We're seeing Trump officials arresting college protesters and threatening them with deportation. So, as a college professor who focuses on marginalized people, I'm curious how you'd recommend people navigating the desire to make your voice heard and stand up for the vulnerable while also being concerned about your own safety and your own vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risk to do this work. That said, I think that this is important enough to take those risks. I mean, any social movement that has succeeded in making change has been costly. And people have paid with their lives. I mean, you think about, MLK, for example, who paid with his life to make the changes that he did that we're sort of backsliding on at the moment. I think people have to weigh what is most important for them, what feels doable for them. But I always tell my students, even in the face of all this, we have to be courageous. We have to be brave. And being brave doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you feel fear and do it anyway. And I think that showing up for protests, boycotting, I mean, obviously, to say we can't boycott Tesla is absolutely unconstitutional. Now, does that mean that the checks and balances will be in place to support us? No, not necessarily. I mean, what's happened to the Columbia student is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional, but it still happened, and he's sitting in a detention center because of his viewpoint. And I don't know, given that Republicans will not do their jobs in Congress and act as a check and balance on this president, and the courts at the federal level are doing some of that, but we don't know if Trump will actually obey the courts. and we don't know what the Supreme Court will do. So all that's to say, yes, it's risky. We don't know what will happen, but we have to do it anyway. We have to be willing to take that risk because this is important enough. This is people's lives, particularly the lives of the most vulnerable in society.
Yeah, definitely. So in your article, you say you recommend to talk to family and friends who voted for Trump, use the power of relationships to inform, educate, and persuade those closest to you to rethink their support of Trump's actions. And I'm interested in this, in especially in that power of relationships idea, because on one hand, relationships are powerful, but on the other hand, when we're dealing with people who have a hierarchical framework of relationships, there are also power dynamics within relationships.
Mhm.
And so, how can we tap into the power of the relationships we have with family and friends without making ourselves unnecessarily vulnerable to abuse? And making sure that we're going to participate in conversations that are at least relatively safe.
So I draw from a principle that's sort of the basis for teaching, which is you start with learners where they are. And so I try to go into these things thinking about how do I say things in a way that this person can hear them? Because it's not going to do any good if I just sort of shout what I think and it shuts them down automatically. That's pointless. But I look for those places where I can say something, or even better, ask a question that might cause them to reflect. Because I think for a lot of these folks, there's probably a lot going on that they don't support. But right now, everything is so partisan that it's very hard for people to say they disagree with anything Trump does if they're a Trump supporter, that somehow that's being disloyal. And certainly Trump frames it that way. And Fox News does, and they're getting a lot of their news from Fox News, which is like living in an alternate reality, I think. And so I think we have to start with where they are to ask those sorts of questions of, you know, well, how do you feel about this? Do you see this in these ways? Or to tell personal stories. I mean, part of the reason that the movement toward marriage equality happened as quickly as it did is because people came out. They told their stories, and it's a lot harder to argue with a story. And so I can tell my coming out story, and now my fears that I might lose my marriage if these folks get their way. That While I think in Oregon I'm relatively safe, that had I been teaching women and gender studies in Florida, I'd be out of a job because some of my colleagues are, simply and solely because of their discipline. Um, and I think those stories are powerful, and those are a place to start as well. And we just kind of have to be, what is it, wise as serpents and harmless as doves, right? To do what we can, also to know where it's pointless and not try to go down those roads. To be the people we want to be, no matter how folks around us are behaving. And it's hard, but I think again, it's something we have to engage in because this moment is so important and it so calls for us to do that.
So, as we engage in these things, you talk about putting up yard signs, knocking on doors, making phone calls to support candidates in preparation of the midterm elections. And I'm curious how you'd recommend budgeting our time and energy either toward national politics or local politics, perhaps between preparing for midterm elections or focusing on local concerns like school boards.
Yeah, I think we have to do kind of a both and. Uh, and I live in Oregon, so state politics, that's good. Things go our way. We have two Democratic senators. We only have one representative in the House who's from Eastern Oregon. The rest of them are Democrats. They're all fairly progressive. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on sort of state stuff. Um, but that may vary. There are other states where people are going to need to focus some there. We definitely need to pay attention to local things. We had an instance a few years back where the right wing tried to run school board candidates here in Corvallis. And so progressives organized and offered a slate of the most progressive candidates you can imagine who are now our school board. And so at that point, uh, in the face of what could have happened in a very progressive city, or Corvallis is one of the bluest dots on the map. We had to organize and focus on local politics for a bit. But at the same time, we have a national administration that may try to force those policies on states like mine. And so we also can't let go of working toward change in Washington as well. And of course, Supreme Court decisions affect us all. And so I think we have to do that balancing act. Some of it may be sort of surveying the terrain to see where are the threats, where can we make the most progress, what do I need to speak to at this moment, and put our energy in those places. And we also can't do everything. So we have to decide where can I be most effective? Where is my energy most needed? And put it there and count on other people to step in and do their part. Because as I said before, we can't do this alone. We need all to work together to make change happen.
Yeah, that's helpful. So, speak like with all the noise that happens, in all of these debates. You mentioned using reliable independent media and staying away from inaccurate or unreliable memes or articles. I
Mhm.
think sometimes I'll see a meme that's meant to provoke outrage towards Trump or make fun of something like his ridiculous policies, and the temptation for me is to share it.
Mhm.
But if we do, sometimes the meme, though I may agree with its aim, it turns out to be false, and then it can end up harming our cause. So, do you have any thoughts, like on social media, how to vet memes or things like that so we don't end up doing more harm than good?
Yeah, I try to fact check those things. And so Snopes.com, there's some PolitiFact, there are places to go where we can check to see whether this stuff is true or not. Because generally, if it's like too good to be true, it probably isn't true. And I think that's important because we can't claim sort of the intellectual high ground if we're engaging in the same sort of misinformation sharing. And I don't think it's an equivalence. I don't think it's even remotely close. But I think we have to do our best to practice what we preach and to make sure that what we're sharing is accurate. And that means fact checking it before we share it out. And fact checking it, again, with reliable places that we can trust. And if we can't figure out whether it's true or not, then don't share it rather than sort of risking it. Even though it might feel really satisfying in the moment, as you said, in the end, it can harm the cause if we're also passing along misinformation.
Well, Dr. Shaw, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your podcast. This has been great to talk to you, and thanks for all the work you do as well.
I loved what Dr. Shaw said about being courageous in the face of fear. During the COVID pandemic, the religious right tried to frame those of us who wore masks and socially distanced as being overcome with fear rather than faith. To them, taking virtually no precautions was an act of faith over fear. It's quite an ironic accusation given how they're the ones using such fear tactics as coercing kids with the threat of hell, or claiming that conservative straight white Christians are the ones being persecuted today. The fact is that it is dangerous to speak up for the vulnerable these days. When authoritarian Christians are admitting to flooding the zone with actions of power over their neighbor, and then threatening retribution on all who resist, there's a danger that's not made up in the minds of moderates and liberals. There are actual people behind bars right now due to the religious right's obsession with power and punishment. There's going to be risk, and in navigating all of this, we're going to make mistakes. But love is taking one step forward through our fear for the sake of those who are being oppressed. In her piece for Baptist News Global, Dr. Shaw has given us 12 action steps we can begin putting into practice. And as we do, we'll figure it out. As Jamar Tisby said yesterday, activism is a skill that takes time and experience to learn. As we clamor for more action to resist this regime, it is good to bear in mind that while we have no time to waste, learning activism is a process. We can get better at this as we learn by doing. That's it for today. Please like, subscribe, share, and rate us in your favorite social media platform. And we'll be back on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.